Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. We are still living in the age of coronavirus, and we will be living in this age for at least the next 8 weeks. I wanted to continue the work that I had planned even before this struck, and what I really wanted to do was have conversations with really smart people that I know about a wide range of topics. So I decided to bring on my friend Chuck to talk about the 2020 Democratic race, to talk about politics, and then over the weekend, a big scandal broke, that Andrew Gillum scandal broke. So I thought, let's talk about that. So I brought him on. He is so knowledgeable. He's worked in politics. He's worked on campaigns for many, many years. This is our conversation. So I wanted to talk to you because you do have a really specialized knowledge around politics. You're one of the most informed and thoughtful people that I have in my circle. When we talk about politics, I always feel like I come away from it knowing more. So you've worked with politicians, you've worked on campaigns. I trust your judgment.
Well, I appreciate that.
All right, so we're going to start off with the Gillum stuff because everybody loves a scandal. I know that this is sensitive. You don't want to dive into the messiness. I understand. So I will say all of the inflammatory stuff, okay?
Okay.
All right. So Andrew Gillum narrowly lost the Florida governor's race in 2018. He was a rising political star of the Democratic Party. So over the weekend, reports came out that Andrew was found in a hotel room, inebriated / unresponsive, like he literally could not respond to the officer. And the police were called to that hotel room because a man was overdosing at the time on crystal meth. So Andrew's initial story was he was just in Miami for a wedding with some friends. At this point, there is no reason for us to believe that initial story, that any part of it was true. Now, what does appear to be true was Andrew was in that hotel room, super drunk with the man who was overdosing on crystal meth with lots of little crystal meth baggies all around him. And people did some digging on one of the men, and he was a gay male escort. Now, initially, I was skeptical of this entire story. I was like, what's going on? There is no way this man knows better. Why would he be doing that? He knows better. But also, I was skeptical because of who was originally tweeting out that story. You know, if Candace Owens is saying it, I'm not gonna believe it. Sorry, girl. But it turned out to be mostly true. I also had some questions about crystal meth. You know, I was like, who does crystal meth? But apparently, and this is my ignorance, I did not know that crystal meth is a very popular party drug in the LGBTQ plus community. It's called Tina. It's a big deal. That was my straight woman privilege. I just had no idea. And then I remembered the story of Ed Buck, who has been indicted in the deaths of 2 gay black men, and he is accused of distributing meth to those men before their deaths. So we have all of this information, we have all of this context, and of course now that is causing people to come to their own conclusions about what was going on. Where were your kids, Andrew? Where's your wife, Andrew? What are you doing in a random hotel room with these men, Andrew? And of course, we don't know what the circumstances are, but we are adults. We have critical thinking skills. We can use our brains to put together some of those pieces. And that means it's not looking great for Andrew Gillum. It's not looking great for his future in politics. Gillum is married. He has 3 children. He's currently a CNN contributor. So what I wanted to ask you was, he has since released another statement and said that he's going to now withdraw from public life. Is that going to be good enough?
You know, I think time tends to heal lots of wounds. As a political matter, at the end of the day, the American people are generally fairly forgiving, particularly given enough time. We, however, don't have a whole lot of experience with a scandal with these particular fact patterns. So, you know, it's a little bit TBD. The jury's out on what the future will hold. But, you know, we'll see.
Look, I really think that depression is one thing. Thankfully, we've had much more robust conversations about mental health and depression. And so I think people can understand that. Drug abuse, substance abuse, that's another thing, right? I also think that we're having much more nuanced conversations about the intersection between your mental health and substance abuse. That's another thing. I think what could be really, really difficult for us to overcome at this point is the gay thing. Now, I don't know anything about Andrew Gillum's sexuality. He, of course, has not commented on it. In fact, in the statement that he released, he didn't even talk about that part. Now, all that other stuff, you can probably explain away and call on Jesus, and you're right back in there. But when it comes to homosexuality, when it comes to an identity as a sexual identity as something other than straight, people are still not fucking with it. I'm just gonna be honest with you. I have lots of conversations about homophobia and dismantling it and dismantling biphobia and all that. People are still not fucking with gay folks like that, especially not gay men. And so I imagine that's going to be a huge hurdle, unfortunately.
It would be nice if if voters could get into that place. I share your worry, is the word I would choose, about the likelihood of that.
Yeah, homophobia is a thing. And I think that we have progressed a lot as a country. I think that we cannot underestimate or minimize the role that homophobia plays still in our culture all across the country. I'm not saying that is particularly endemic to the South, but that's still a thing. But I also think that if we're talking about forgiveness in this country, we also have to talk about the intersection of forgiveness and race, right? And so certain kinds of people are much more able to bounce back from these kinds of setbacks, these kinds of scandals. And unfortunately, that kind of grace is not always often extended to Black folks, okay?
Yeah, I'll just say, you had Jim McGreevey in Jersey a little while back. You had Larry Craig, that the bathroom thing, and you've had obviously Anthony Weiner, David Vitter, senator from Louisiana, was caught up in the DC Madam thing. So, there have been a series of these over the years with varying results. Vitter was able to survive the DC Madam thing. The other three I just mentioned did not, and their careers were over. Spitzer eventually kind of bounced back some years later with a CNN show, short-lived, and maybe he'll have a future. So, it's different cases turn out in different ways. I think it's an Overton window kind of a thing. You look at how the Overton window has shifted over the years from Defensive Marriage Act in the 90s and Clinton signing that to, the Supreme Court decision in Oberfeld in 2012. So, the kind of cultural attitudes around these things have shifted in a relatively short period of time over the last few decades. So project that forward and imagine how public opinion might shift and change and the culture might change 10, 20 years from now. Possibly, who knows? Again, it's TBD. We'll see.
We'll see. I have no idea what an Overton window is, so I really only caught half of that. What are you talking about?
Yeah, sorry. There's a political science thing of theory about ideas or moving and popular support from impossible or inconceivable to policy or law. Take, for example, marriage equality or other ideas like Medicare for all or free college that are being talked about now. You pick any political issue and you take it from where it started out as being inconceivable or impossible, right? But never happened. Civil rights, for example, women's rights, and it progressed over time to slightly more likely, a little bit more likely, and then eventually became law. So it's just a kind of an evolution in time of how the electorate shifts its attitudes and views on a topic.
He has a Black wife, so if he can stick with the Black wife, call on Jesus, stay squeaky clean, talk about his transformation, he can do it, but it's gonna be hard. Okay, let's move on. I have lots of questions about Bernie and Biden. Okay, so what happened to Bernie Sanders' campaign? How are we here? Like, I just looked at 538. I'm a Nate Silver stan. And according to 538 and the polling that they have done, Joe Biden has a 99% chance of being the Democratic nominee. And a month ago, I said in public that we needed to prepare ourselves for Bernie Sanders to be the nominee. How are we here?
Right. Well, Bernie Sanders was always going to have an uphill challenge in winning the Democratic nomination. Frankly, this is another interesting Overton window thing where, you take a lot of his his platform. And, polling indicates, so they've done exit polling in a series of these primary states as they voted and found that Medicare for All, for example, has substantial support in Democratic primaries. That obviously was not the case 4 years ago. He has put issues on the map, he and Elizabeth Warren both, that were nowhere near on the kind of political radar even just a year or two ago. Those two, Warren and Sanders, have been sort of single-handedly responsible for skyrocketing issues in popularity that even a year or two ago, if you look at the polling on, we're probably in the low teens or the 20s. Again, like Medicare for All, free college, or debt-free college.
I know people are going to say, though, that people always say to me that Elizabeth Warren just piggybacked off of Bernie Sanders, that all she did was adopt Sanders' stances and make them more palatable to people like me.
Yeah, well, somewhat. She had a whole lot of policies that he didn't have. For example, the pre-K piece. There's ways in which I think that her being a woman informed her policy and politics in a way substantially different than Sanders. I think that her having a kind of a feminist intersectional lens gave her an antenna that was attentive to those types of issues in a way not so, or at least not to the same degree with Sanders. So I would point to those as important differences in their platforms.
So I was listening to 538 this morning, and or was it? Oh no, I was reading a New York Times article about Bernie Sanders this morning, and something that the author of that article said was that Bernie's ceiling and his floor with electoral support were the same. And so once he maxed out those people who bought into the movement, there was nowhere else for him to go. And that's why when all of the centrists and the quote unquote establishment, when they formed a Voltron, like a centrist Voltron, he couldn't get more voters after that. Do you agree with that?
Possibly. I mean, it's a little bit TBD. I mean, people said the exact same thing about Trump in the 16 primary, that his floor and his ceiling were the same, and that ended up turning out not to be the case. One thing that is absolutely true, the case here is, Sanders could have been Trump. And in terms of his, to your point, what you're just talking about, floors and ceilings. And the reason that Sanders didn't play out the way that Trump did is because the Republican field in 16 stayed large. Many of them stayed in and did drop out, as what happened in the Democratic primary this year, with Klobuchar and Buttigieg dropping out the day before Super Tuesday and coming out and endorsing Biden. So the field winnowed quickly and coalesced around Biden. And then immediately after Super Tuesday, the next two highest people in polling, Bloomberg and Warren, dropped out. So, within the span of a week, you had four of the competitors drop out, making it a two-man race between Joe and Bernie. So that's the opposite of what happened in the 16 primary. And the Republicans' failure to winnow the field down to fewer candidates is what gave us Trump. But as I say, the opposite happened here. And so because it winnowed, it allowed Biden to soak up all of the kind of moderate centrist lane.
It's so interesting, right? Because so many criticisms of the DNC and the Democratic establishment is they don't know how to win. They don't know how to get organized. Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And what happened this year was like the establishment was like, no. Like, we're falling in line. It's so interesting that like they finally figured out how to like get their shit and like get it together. And unfortunately, it has suppressed Bernie's movement.
Yeah, there are two very old adages in politics. One is, I belong to no organized party. I'm a Democrat. And the other old saying is, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line with respect to choosing candidates. And again, yes, to your point, these last two cycles have been the exact opposite of that, at least with respect to the last one. Republicans, or Democrats in this case, fell in line rather than waiting for the candidate to send the spark up their leg, as Chris Matthews said about Obama in 2008.
Yeah. And in what I've been reading about the Sanders campaign and what they thought was their path to victory was they thought that they were just going to get by with just getting a plurality of winning 30% up until...
because it worked for Trump. It worked for Trump. And if the field had stayed large, that strategy would have worked. The only reason it didn't work is because the field narrowed. If it had stayed 5 or 6 candidates, then he could have kept winning states just like he did prior to Super Tuesday with, 30, 35% of the vote or less. You can keep winning with relatively small pluralities, if the vote is split 5, 6 ways, but a vote split 2 ways, that strategy no longer works.
And that is also why when I hear Bernie and his supporters kind of whine about the establishment, I don't get too upset because it's like you were trying to finagle the rules so that you could get by on 30%, right? Like the establishment decided to do what was in their best interest in the same way that he was trying to do what was in his best interest. And it just so happened that the rules didn't work out. Now that we're in the age of coronavirus, can you have a movement without rallies? Can you have a movement without being able to draw people out? Like, I feel like a big part of that, like, not me, us thing was people going out to the rallies and, Bernie and all of that stuff. And it just seems like you can't really get that momentum back, right?
Perhaps, but also, it was never clear to me that the crowd size was translating into votes on election day. And I think we have good reason to be skeptical that was the case. Bernie has always had great crowd sizes. A good chunk of those are also young people. And the turnout among young people in this primary so far has been decent, but not like overwhelming. So there's that. So I think that there's a disconnect between crowd size and actual votes on election day. So I'm not sure how much the rallies were actually helping Bernie in terms of votes. I mean, sure, in terms of energy, excitement, creating a media narrative and optics, all of those things it gave him. But it's just not clear that there was a one-for-one relationship between crowd size and votes on election day, particularly given that, again, older people who are Biden's base vote more always in every election. That's always the case, and that's Biden's bread and butter. And so when your base is the reliable voters who always turn out, which is Biden, versus when your base is skews so much younger and tends to be the far less reliable voters, again, that's a very difficult electoral problem for you if you're trying to win.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of older voters, Black people over 50 love Joe Biden. They love him. They go up for him. What was the split in it was like 80-20 or something like from Michigan or something? It was insane.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Mississippi, South Carolina. Yeah. Multiple states.
Yeah. Okay. So when people are talking about the Democratic establishment, right, and how Joe Biden is the candidate of the Democratic establishment, I think something that's been difficult for a lot of folks to reconcile is, okay, so we can talk about the DNC and the donor class and all that, but then how do we talk about the most loyal Democratic voters, which is old Black people over 50, how do they factor into our discussions about who is rooting for Joe Biden and whose support they have?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a lot of writing and reporting on this, especially from folks like Osted at New York Times and Jamel Bowie and others who've done great writing and reporting. Basically, the theory that I am basically persuaded by is that in general, Black people's voting behavior and preferences is characterized by a risk aversion. Black people are concerned to protect existing gains and to see to it that they are not eroded. And if what you're selling is a kind of a riskier gambit, then that butts up against a risk aversion kind of paradigm. If that's how you're approaching who to vote for, then you're going to tend to go with the safer choice rather than kind of a riskier one, which is Sanders. So I think that is what's been going on with Black voting behavior, and I think that's what explains, particularly again, as you say, for older African Americans, the preference for Biden over Sanders, and it also explains again the generational divide among Black folks. I mean, if you're a millennial, I think we just have a different kind of risk calculation outlook than our parents' generation. I mean, you're talking about, every time I hear a boomer talk about, they bought a home in 1970 something for like $30,000 at a 3.5% interest rate, and gas was like, a nickel. And it's just like, you just want to, like, I don't know, bang your head into a wall or something is what makes me want to do. And they have sort of no concept of our lives in lived reality. And, you heard Elizabeth Warren talk about how cheap college per semester was for her. I don't remember the figure she threw out, but I thought it was like a couple hundred or maybe a couple $1,000 a semester or something insane. And I think she paid for on a waitress job. I mean, that's just inconceivable today, given the multifold increase in college tuition rates from the 80s to now, and healthcare costs. So you got healthcare, housing, and education costs, which have all just gone through the roof over the last couple of decades. And so boomers just lived in a whole different America, and even Gen X, between millennials and boomers, they really, to a large degree, had a different America, the 90s tech boom and all of that. So,
but there also has to be something about just loyalty to the Democratic Party. I mean, I think that, like, older Black people are loyal to the establishment, right? Like, if you live through the civil rights gains of 60s, 70s into the 80s, when there became like a Black yuppie class, right? Like, Black people for the first time had the opportunities to enter into these institutions, right, that they were previously excluded from. They associate a lot of those gains with the Democratic Party. And there are probably going to be some consequences for your position being, of you positioning yourself as the outsider. Bernie continually thumbing his nose at the Democratic Party itself and the Democratic establishment and kind of like making fun of them. And it turned out like people are fucking with the establishment. Like, the people who show up to vote might actually feel some loyalty to the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think, and there's definitely, I think, polling that's talked about that younger Black folks identify less kind of at an institutional level, frankly, with either party, but relevant to this conversation, less with the Democratic Party. There's just less institutional identification there. It's characteristic, again, of our generation versus older generations.
Yeah. And, something else I thought about was maybe Black people, older Black people, like to be pandered to. There's lots of conversation about how Bernie Sanders, didn't go to Mississippi and all of this stuff. And he has not yet really made a definitive race speech, right? Like, he's very much like a class over race person. And like, maybe old Black folks want you to explicitly talk about issues facing Black people and why the Black experience is unique. And it seems like maybe Bernie Sanders can't do that because, like, a part of his coalition, this coalition that he's built, which they always tout as being so diverse, but like, a part of that does mean like rejecting identity in that way, like rejecting explicit calls to identity. And so, like, you're not going to be able to get Black folks who have a certain kind of worldview that way.
Yeah, well, I certainly think that Bernie's class over race, particularly to the extent that means class to the exclusion of race, hurts him and is definitely a policy and political blind spot for him. Particularly as it relates to getting Black votes, what I would say his specific problem was a lack of organizing, so far as I understand it, from my reading and talking to folks on campaigns and kind of consulting. I think a really good example of this was I saw an interview Sanders gave where a reporter asked him if he sought Jim Clyburn's endorsement in South Carolina, like if he even tried to get it, and Sanders said no, flat out, because his and Clyburn's politics are different, and he said there's no chance in the world he was going to get Clyburn's endorsement. Now, the problem with that is, and I say this from having worked in politics my whole life, that just violates Rule 101 of politics that you go after every vote. You at least attempt to. You show up and you make your pitch and you try to get it. And you do that even in lost cause situations where you know you're not going to get it. I mean, and if you're not doing that, then you're actually really not running a real campaign that's playing to win, because it's just violative of a fundamental rule of campaigning and politics. And so, you know, what was the Sanders campaign outreach to the Congressional Black Caucus, to, you know, churches, both South and North, to a variety of Black organizations, whether you're talking about the NAACP, the Urban League, Black Rico organizations, what have you, you know, the Black Reporters Association, you know, on and on and on. And from my understanding, their outreach, if you can even call it that, was minimal to non-existent. So I would say that's really the problem. It's, you know, Black people aren't unique or distinctive in this way. It's every other vote. You got to show up and ask for it. If you're trying to get farmers vote, you got to go talk to farmers. If you're trying to get the women's vote, you got to go talk to women. If you're trying to, you know, if you're trying to get college kids, you go to college campuses and you hold rallies, right? Whatever group you're trying to get, you know, you want to get gun owners, you go to the NRA convention. You want to, you know, whatever the group is. So Black people aren't different in that regard. They want people to show up, ask for their vote. You know, you actually have to invest time and manpower and labor hours investment to build those coalitions and put boots on the ground in those communities and talk to people. You got to do it, or else you're not going to get those votes.
I agree with you, and I think that is like the such a good and real critique of like, who is on the ground? Who are you even sending to organize on behalf of Bernie Sanders? Because I have said publicly the Sanders campaign would have done well to recruit some Black surrogates that Black people actually like. But one thing that I did think is different was like, so like in Nevada, you know, for the Nevada caucuses, I listen to the Daily every day. I know you don't. But what was interesting was like the higher up people in the like the unions and stuff, like they wanted Biden, right? And then it was like the lower down people wanted Bernie. And so there was like a distinct split. I don't know if when it comes to Black voting patterns, if we would see that kind of split, right? Like if because, you know, Black folks love a hierarchy. I love Black people, I'm just saying. And so if, you know, the higher up people in your Greek letter organization or in your union or whatever, if they said Biden, or if your pastor said, I want Biden, do you think that the congregants would say, well, no, I want Bernie? Like, I don't know. It just seems like maybe there is more of like, this is my, like, I'm going with whatever you say, Pastor, or not that Black people can't think for themselves, but I do think that there's more of like, we stick together, like, more like a voting block mentality that maybe we wouldn't see in other kinds of groups, other kinds of communities.
Yeah, so I think it was Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom on Twitter, who I follow and really enjoy, author of Lower Ed and Thick, and always has such insightful commentary.
I love these
and
references. Come through with the references. Okay.
I love her. And so she said something, I think, which is really spot on this and links precisely to what you're saying. And she said, her joke was, you know, Black people, we are a who your people kind of people. Like, we want to know who are your people sort of thing. And it's, you know, particularly she's coming from a Southern lens, and especially talking about in the South, and, you know, where, you know, and, you know, I'm from the South, and so I get it. And there's a sense of, you know, like I met a random, you know, I can't tell you how many times in the South, I mean, you meet somebody and, you know, they're ask you about your family, and people can sort of trace family trees and they go, people want to know. Are you kin? Yeah. Are you kin to so-and-so? And are you so-and-so's boy? I mean, that's just how we do in the South. And so, you know, and so what that means, I think, is that what people are looking for are validators. And I think it's a version of what you're saying. And I would say, particularly in the Black community, I think we look for validators, and that's the, who are your people question. It's like, you know, who else gets down with you kind of thing. And do people get down with you whose opinion I value and trust and, you know, and think is relevant, right? That's the kind of the test and the barometer. And so it's looking for, right, you know, who are those other people, you know, and so pastors perform that function for congregations in a lot of places. Yes. the function they're performing is they're acting as a validator. They're saying, I trust this person, and so I think that therefore you should. And because the people who listen to that person value their opinion and think that they have good judgment, that is why they translate that to support of a candidate. So, yeah, I mean, not every pastor has that kind of juice and sway, but certainly, several do, depending on where you are. But not only pastors. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's always, eats me up in politics is folks want to talk to Black people, and the only place they want to go is to the church. And yes, we are a very religious people, but, that's not the only place, right?
Right.
I've done campaigns to do barbershop and beauty shop chats, for example. And that's, there are other things, you've got Black radio, you've got Black newspapers. There are all sorts of avenues and venues to talk to Black folks, not just the church. And there are all sorts of validators in the community other than just pastors and religious leaders. They are one. I mean, that's to be clear. I mean, they are one source of validation, but there are others as well. And if campaigns wanted to be creative, I think a little bit outside the box, or again, just talk to some Black folks, they could tell you other validators. What's the place that, Black folks are frequenting in that town? And that varies from city to city, which is why you need local intel. You need local folks on the ground who live there and know the city and know the community, who can tell you where to go, who to talk to, who people listen to and follow. And so, I mean, and I'm just describing what a campaign is.
Right. Yeah.
So Bernie's failure to do that is indicative of you're not running a campaign, at least not a real one that's trying to win, because that's what you do if you're trying to win.
All right. So there was a debate last night that I didn't watch because it was boring and Real Housewives was on. But I saw some clips and I saw Joe Biden reiterate his promise to pick a woman vice president and to put a woman on the Supreme Court if he was elected.
I'll appoint the first Black woman to the courts. It's required that they have representation now. It's long overdue. Secondly, if I'm elected president, my cabinet, my administration will look like the country. And I commit that I will, in fact, pick a woman to be vice president. There are a number of women who are qualified to be president tomorrow. I would pick a woman to be my vice president.
And Joe Biden has Black people's vote locked up. I don't know. So I'm just, and he's also winning women handily. So I just wonder.
Yeah, but it's a turnout game. It's a turnout game at this point. Yeah, it isn't just enough to win Black folk or any group of people. What you want to do is to drive up turnout. I think, I forgot who said it. I think it might have been Stu Stevens, who's actually a Republican political consultant, but he puts it right. What's going to decide this election in November between Trump and Biden is the racial and demographic composition of the electorate. That will be the decisive factor, is how white the electorate is or how of color it is, how educated it is or not, how male versus female it is, and the class distribution. I would say those are the four key demographic vectors that the election will turn on: race, gender, class, and college educated versus not. I think, for example, 12, Trump did, I think, worse with college educated whites than maybe any Republican in a long time, if not decades or something. So that's what's going to decide this thing, right? His bread and butter is non-college educated white men in particular. That's his bread and butter. And so the name of the game for Trump is to jack up turnout among non-college educated white men. The name of the game for Biden will be the exact opposite, to drive up turnout among college educated white women and African Americans and Latinos. That's the name of the game for Biden. So they have two opposite incentive structures and two opposite demographic groups that they're trying to turn out. And whoever does the better job of turning out those particular demographics, that will be the winner.
So I understand why people might opt for Biden if you feel like he is the most quote unquote electable. But something that concerns me about Joe Biden, just as somebody who has very strong beliefs, is I don't know what Joe Biden's beliefs are. I don't know where he really stands on issues. But it turns out most people don't care. People don't care where he stands now. People don't care where he stood 30 years ago. When people are endorsing Bernie, right, they tout his consistency. He's been consistent for 40 years and he's always voted the same thing. But it turns out People don't care. Like, so like, how, like, do we even know what a Biden administration would do or be, or like how can we even like put any kind of faith in Joe Biden?
I think the big X factor is Trump. And so, as you say, yes, I think there's a lot of people who probably maybe don't know what Biden's positions on a variety of issues are, but I think they have a gut instinct that whatever his policies are, they will be better than Trump. And so at the end of the day, I think that's what people are coming back to, and the basis upon which they're deciding is, okay, I'm okay with whatever unknowns I have about Biden because I'm confident that he'll be better than Trump. So, I think that's what that is.
You think people don't vote on policy for real?
Not really. Yeah, no, I don't. I think most voters, it's gut instincts. We're also living in the era of partisanship and what political science is called negative partisanship. That is, it's what drives people's voting behavior a lot is dislike of the other party, even more so than support of their own party. So that's negative partisanship. And that, there's been a lot of studies documenting the rise of that over the last few decades. From the 80s to now, for example, that negative partisanship used to be less of a thing. There used to be one measure of that, for example, is there used to be far more crossover voters in America. That is, people who split their ballots, that would vote for a Democrat for certain offices, but Republican for other offices. Right? That it wasn't a straight party line ticket. From president on down to dog catcher, just voting the same party. It used to be the case that people would split their ballot and vote for some Republicans and some Democrats. And some people still do, but far, far, far fewer people than used to do that. Most, it's been a sharp increase in people being just straight party line voters. Republicans go in that booth and just vote straight Republican, and Democrats go in that booth and vote straight Democrat. Used to be the case, less so. So hyperpartisanship is a big thing now. And also, I think, as I said, I think gut feeling too. I think it's people voting party, and it's people dislike of the opposite party. And then I think, humans being humans, I'm quite persuaded basically by behavioral economics and what it teaches us about human behavior. We have recency bias, for example, and there's kind of inertia bias of whatever we've been doing, kind of preferring it, and a kind of resistance to change, for example. And there's information gathering challenges with, going on the internet and doing research about policies and candidates' background and reading up on them that most people are just not going to do. You can blame some of that on laziness, but there's also just, people have jobs and lives and kids and families to take care of, and just other things to do in their lives, other than Googling about Medicare for all or tax policy. Most people aren't interested in that, and kind of makes their eyes glaze over.
Yeah, these men are so old. They're so old. Okay, they are so old. When I watched, people accuse me of ageism, and this is ageism, and I will own it and cop to it, but it's like, we're in this like pandemic. If somebody coughs on one of these people, like, you're done. Okay. Anyways, so when I was doing research, that I'm gonna have to cut that out because that is inappropriate. So anyways, when I was doing research before I wanted to sit down and talk to you, I was just looking at like polls over time, and one of the things that I was looking at was support for socialized medicine, healthcare, universal healthcare. I mean, there's like 20 things that it's called over time. And something that I thought was so fascinating, I looked at polls from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and in 2006, 72% of Republicans favored government getting more involved in healthcare. 72% in 2006. And 2006 is also the year that Romney Care went into effect. And now it's down to like 40-something%. And it's like, it's just about Democrats making universal health care a part of the platform.
Yeah, I think that's a factor.
Okay, tell me what the other ones are.
Well, I mean, to your point, George W. Bush also expanded Medicare when he was in office. He created a whole new entitlement program, Medicare Part D for seniors. And so that was an expansion of the social safety net, particularly in the healthcare space, and a conservative Republican did it. So, yeah, and that was just a couple of years before Romney did Romney Care, as you say, in Massachusetts. And so, yeah, I mean, the Republicans doing these things. President Obama, of course, liked to point out during the fights over the ACA when he was in office that the mandate that's in the ACA actually came from the Heritage Foundation. So you had conservative think tanks, writing about these things prior to Obama, and all that's true. It's also true that, the Republican Party has gotten a lot more conservative, particularly since Reagan. I mean, the 80s onward, it's kind of roughly where that shift is dated to. Big picture, the theory that I am most persuaded by at the end of the day is that race is the kind of prime mover governing these things. There's been, research in the poli-sci sociological literature for a while now, looking at the Nordic countries of Europe, Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden, these large social safety nets that they have, what people call socialist countries. It's debatable whether that's the correct term for it, but regardless, they have much, much larger social safety nets than we do here.
Those countries don't call themselves socialist countries, by the way.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I say, we can, I'll stay away from the labeling of the terms, but they have a much, much larger social safety net than we do here. And point being, there's been, this theory for a long time. Why are they able to do that? Well, it's because they are overwhelmingly white countries, and that it's the homogeneity of the population that allows for the requisite political cohesion to sustain the support for example, cash payments widely distributed to the general population, that white people are willing to do that and to support that when it's overwhelmingly people that they see as like them. And they are far less likely to have that kind of a social safety net to take care of people when they see the population demographically significantly changing to people dissimilar to them in their opinion. And so that is what explains the difference between us, America, versus the Nordic countries, that we're so much more diverse country. And that's why we likely will never have the social safety net programs of the Nordic countries. Now, that's a theory. People can dispute it and do dispute it, but on the evidence, it's the one that I'm most persuaded by. And another further piece of evidence for that is increasingly in the last decade or so, as Europe, the EU have opened up and they've liberalized their immigration laws, those Nordic countries have increasingly gotten more diverse. They're nowhere near as diverse as we are in America, or that even Western Europe countries are, like, Britain and Germany and France. The Nordics are still incredibly white compared to everywhere else. But immigration has ticked up a little bit relative to where it used to be in those countries. And as it has, there has been this resurgence of kind of far-right fascist parties in the Nordic countries, increasing their vote share in their parliamentary elections and gaining popularity by spreading this message of the same kind of Trumpian message of blaming immigrants, and the quality of life is going down because the country is getting browner and people are coming in from these poorer countries and they're going to be a drag on the system, and on and on and on, and you don't want your tax dollars going to them. So that's what we've seen in our politics here forever, right? The Reagan welfare thing comes to mind, and Nixon and others. I mean, so
racism is a great motivator, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I get really concerned that in 2020, we're going to face a scenario like we faced in 2016, where people who were all in for Bernie completely abstain from participating in the election, and then Trump wins. But I have been reading things from political scientists that I trust and political people whom I really trust, saying that if we get Biden, we have a greater chance of beating Trump, because that's going to bring in all the centrists, the older people who really vote. We're going to bring in the moderate Republicans, the never Trumpers, and then Trump is out, and then we get a Biden presidency. Do you think that we have a greater chance of winning in December? And by we, I mean Democrats. Do you think that Democrats have a greater chance of winning with Biden than they do with Bernie?
Yeah, so a couple things there. First of all, never Trumpers, there are like four of them left. So nobody's winning an election with never Trumpers. And even the category of quote unquote moderate Republicans is getting pretty close to an extinct species nowadays. So I've always thought that any election strategy for the general that was focused on that group is fairly flawed. I don't think that there are enough gettable Republicans for Democrats to win an election. Similarly, the idea of independence is mostly pretty overhyped because even most people who self-identify or registered as independents, for all practical purposes, are functionally either Republicans or Democrats because on actual election days they tend to vote, all the time for one or the other. So there aren't very many true, genuine independents left in the country anymore, nor are there very many gettable Republicans for a Democrat, again, because of the partisanship and negative partisanship I mentioned earlier. So I think that, I don't think the Democrats have a lot to be hanging their hopes on those things. At the end of the day, what it comes down to, I said earlier, the whiter, more male, and less college educated the electorate is, Trump wins. The less white, the more college educated, and the more female the electorate is, Biden wins. At the end of the day, that demographic calculation is what's going to decide the election. As to the Bernie people, another thing there, I think, just two little things. One, I think the difference between this year versus 4 years ago, the primary between Bernie and Hillary that this showed us, is a lot of Bernie's support that he got in 2016 wasn't actually really pro-Bernie. It was just anti-Hillary.
Yeah.
I think that the difference between his showing in state after state this year, you compare it to how he performed in those exact same states 4 years ago against Hillary. Michigan, for example, that he won last time, but against Hillary, but he lost this time to Biden, and several other states that's true of. He won it against Hillary, but lost it to Biden this year. It shows that he's just had this steep drop-off in support, and he bled a whole bunch of support that went to him 4 years ago. He's bled it over to Biden, and that's because a lot of those people voting for him 4 years ago weren't really for him. They were just against Hillary. They disliked her so much for a whole host of reasons, and including just kind of protest, anti-establishment, stick a finger in the system kind of vote was why they were voting for Bernie. So I think that's the case. And then final point relative to Bernie is I think some commentator or maybe political scientist I saw made the observation, and I think I'm persuaded by it, that a good chunk of those Bernie votes, in fact, for all intents and purposes, Bernie voters from 4 years ago, for all intents and purposes, are now Trump voters. And that over the course of this first term of his presidency, they moved into the Trump camp. And so, again, for that reason, are not gettable for the Democrats this go around. So I think all of those factors are at play. And so, at the end of the day, Dems got to turn out their base. That is the roadmap to victory for Democrats. And again, it's getting the demographic formula on election day right. You got to drive out turnout among African Americans, among Latinos, among women, among college educated whites.
Yeah, it's so it's just so funny because as a person who spends my days reading the New York Times and reading the Washington Post, and I feel like I'm pretty deep in the weeds of policy. People do not care about policy. People do not care.
Yeah.
So why am I even stressing myself out about this? I don't know. That is all I have. Thank you so much. This was so good. You were so good.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
I wanted to note that we are still helping mothers get money for groceries and whatever their current needs are. If you are a mother who needs help, email info@forharriet.com. If you are a potential donor, email info@forharriet.com, and we will match y'all up We're going to use this platform to help as many people in need as possible. Thank you guys so much for your willingness to give. Thank you for your openness. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.